Welcome to Asian Insider, a podcast series by the Straits Times. I'm your host, Nirmal Ghosh. Now, as usual in American elections, domestic policy dominates the agenda. But in terms of foreign policy, there is a lot going on. The wars in Ukraine and the Middle East are the immediate contentious issues, of course, but the China factor casts a very long shadow, one might say. We have heard both candidates, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, talk about China, and what either of them does with regard to China will reverberate across Asia and the Indo Pacific, affecting half the population of the planet. I have with me today Stephen Oken, CEO of APAC Advisors. Steve served in the Clinton administration and is a veteran of numerous Democratic presidential campaigns. And I have Dr. Satu Limay, Vice President of the East West Center and Director of the East West Center's office in Washington, D.C. Among other things, Satu created the Asia Matters for America initiative and is the founding editor of the Asia Pacific Bulletin. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
So, Satu, let me start with you. We saw what Donald Trump did when he was president, pulling out of the Trans Pacific Partnership, putting tariffs on Chinese products. We can talk a bit about that later, and I'll bring Steve in for that. But first, on the security and diplomacy side, under the past 4 years of Joe Biden, we have seen the Quad arrangement solidifying. That's India, Australia, Japan, and the United States. And we saw AUKUS, the pact that will eventually get Australia nuclear powered submarines by the early 2030s. China remains very much on the minds of the strategic community in DC. How are things shaping up on that front? What direction is this going in? What are the differences you expect from these two candidates?
Well, thank you, Nirmal, for having me on Asian Insider again, and great to be here along with Steve Oken. There is no question that there are some continuities, and I think it's important to flag what's happened over the last roughly 10 years or so, right? First, as you rightly and accurately depicted, there's a hardening of US-China strategic competition and counter-China policies. And that runs from approximately the issuance of the 2017 Trump administration national security strategy document onward through today. This executive branch hardening reflected in both Indo-Pacific strategies of the Trump and the Biden administrations is also reflected in an extraordinary move by the United States Congress, which is run essentially by a calendar. And to think that they gave an entire week to China on legislation. So I've lost count of the number of bills that have been introduced to counter China in various ways, everything from fentanyl to looking at outward bound investments, obviously inward bound investments, trade issues, tariff issues, education issues, visa issues, sanctions issues. So China is front and center. And if anything in Asia gets attention marginally, glancingly in this election, it has been China in one way or another. That is refracted on all our Asia relations. We're about, in 2020, the East-West Center produced a report called The Hardening of U.S. PRC Strategic Competition and Asian Responses. And we had to sort of resist putting the same title this year because we think that the region is primarily responding to its alignments on that front. And we see very mixed views in Philippines, Taiwan, and ROK. We see strong alignment in Japan, though we'll have to see with new Prime Minister Ishiba. We see quite a lot of alignment in India. Southeast Asia, as you well know, and you guys also are very attuned to this, has a mix of responses. But as I've put it before, most countries in Asia seek to stay on the right side of the United States, that is to say, productive cooperative relations, and off the wrong side of China. And that's, I think, where we are today.
Okay, Steve, you are based in Singapore normally. You have your finger on the pulse of corporate Southeast Asia. What is the view from where you sit of the way the campaign is unfolding in the US? Are people following what's going on? And what are the concerns and thoughts that are uppermost, so to speak?
I have a lot of friends across the region who say to me, it's really not fair that only you Americans get to vote for your president because your election impacts us so much. We should have a vote too. So yes, people are following this election. I think they're following this election. They always follow presidential elections in the US. This one even more so, because this election will have real consequences depending on who wins. I think directionally, like the US-China relationship is going to be more tense. It is going to have more friction. It is going to have more competition, regardless of who wins. But a Harris administration, which presumably would be identical to a Biden administration of having a multilateral work with partners and allies approach to the region, is very different than a Trump approach, which is going to go back to America first, a bilateral approach. And the countries are going to be very different, certain countries under a Trump administration than under a Harris administration. And that is why they are watching this election so closely. And, it's from the basic questions. Okay, explain your electoral college to me again. How does this work? How can you lose the popular vote and still win? To much more nuanced questions of what's going to happen to trade policy, what's going to happen to IPEF, what's going to happen to the Quad. The top question, I think for sure, is what would a Trump administration mean for Taiwan with regards to U.S.-China. So yes, normal people are following this even more closely than they normally follow U.S. elections, which is closely.
Sathu, you're currently in Bangkok. Are you picking up something similar?
Yeah, I am. I've just been through the region. I was in Vietnam for the 1 year anniversary of the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership dialogue. I was in Singapore a few days ago, and here in Bangkok. So I've been traveling through the region, Philippines. I'll tell you, what Steve said is exactly right. Asia always watches US elections. And I think the last time I found so much interest was, quite frankly, in 2016, when there was a real incredible menu of Asia related issues front and center of the campaign. China. Should allies pay more for their defense? Should they be allowed to have nukes? Is a deal possible with North Korea? Stay in or stay out of TPP? All those discussions in 2016 were, I can't remember a time when Asia was so front and center of American presidential campaign. Foreign policy was still low, but of foreign policy, that was low. This is a completely different situation. People are refracting other issues into how it's going to implicate Asia. What are those issues? One, the two candidates, as Steve said, people are reading these candidates. Two, they're reading responses to Ukraine as implications for them. Third, they're also reading the Middle East, and they're viewing it from angles ranging from this means the pivot will never happen to see the US does back allies to wait a minute, how do we square this with mixed views about supporting Ukraine? Right? So where you sit is how you view a lot of things. And I have come away with three big takeaways. One, American elections, American politics today, I think it's fair to say, is fairly boisterous, contested, polarized if you want. But I'm amazed by the level of contestation and polarization across Asia in different ways. See Taiwan, KMT DPP with a TPP party in the legislative yuan. See a National Assembly majority by progressives in South Korea with a conservative president running to elections. See the leadership struggle in Japan, not particularly contested, it's still LDP, but the debate around a succession of Mr. Kishida in Japan. See Philippines, where the fight between Vice President Duterte and President Marcos Jr. are playing out. So that's one. The second is, while they're refracting Ukraine and Gaza, it is extraordinary to me that some of the immediate challenges in the region are very present and imminent. Examples: North Korea moving away from eventual reunification and testing. Russia supporting Ukraine, increasing alignments between China, Ukraine, China, Russia, and North Korea, maybe Iran and other things in this context, evolving dynamic. I don't know. South China Sea, the pressures on Japan by Russia and China. So that's the second thing. And the third thing is a more fundamentally understanding of the fragmented, multipolar, and deconstructing international order of the last 70 years. To me, the interesting thing is no one is sort of unclear that certain continuities between our elections is going to reverberate in Asia. One is just what I call insulationism, not isolationism. You can again measure it how you want, but certain insulationism, inward looking focus. Second, very little support for international trade and sort of the old way of globalization. And third, I think a real view that this hardening of the China issue, if it as and if and as and how it continues, will create pressures or navigation challenges for particularly allies and partners, but even others who are hedging. But again, the default I remain is the US still remains, as far as I can tell in my analysis and interviews and walks through the region, the default power. I think there's significant concern structurally more than only about candidates. There's concern about candidates, but that's viewed through these various lenses. But there's a more structural concern about where the U.S. is headed, how much reliability, how much engagement, et cetera.
Right. So let me stay with you just for a second before I get back to Steve. Since you're talking about Southeast Asia, the U.S. role is appreciated not just as a long-term investor and in some cases an ally, but in security terms more broadly as an offshore balancer. In fact, the U.S. is sometimes seen as wooing Southeast Asia, and that theoretically at least puts Southeast Asia in a good position. Although one has to say Muslim Southeast Asian countries have gone after the United States thanks to what is going on in the Middle East. But does the United States understand Southeast Asia? Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's huge public understanding, but I think there are a lot of effort first. Our bilateral relationships run pretty long and deep in Southeast Asia, and it's easy to overlook them because of the ASEAN or regional perspective. So the strategic framework agreement with Singapore has been recalibrated, doubled down on, extended in duration. And we have Singapore F-35s purchased from the United States, going to be parked in Guam. I mean, the defense relationship in a strategic partnership framework is pretty darn strong. We have two new comprehensive strategic partnerships, as I mentioned earlier, with Vietnam, but also with Indonesia, importantly, as President-elect Prabowo prepares to take office. I think that Thailand, we have this long running alliance, to be sure, a very different alliance than 70s, 80s, 90s, et cetera. But we still have a very significant presence here and working relationship in terms of security ties, defense ties, economic ties. So I think we do understand it. I think the difficulty is as we move to a hardening U.S.-China strategic competition and counter-China narrative, it's difficult to appreciate how that runs against Southeast Asian equities that are quite stovepiped in this larger competition. Give you an example. The restrictions put on solar imports from Southeast Asia today. The idea that countries and companies are looking for China plus one strategies, which implicate a country, particularly, let's just use the example of Vietnam, China plus one strategy. But then Vietnam runs a large deficit with the United States, which reverberates in the US Congress, not to mention market economy status, which was denied by the Department of Commerce. So you have a chapeau of hardening U.S.-China strategic competition in a context of fragmentation and deglobalization, but you have individual equities of Southeast Asian states. That makes Southeast Asia hard, but Southeast Asia is hard for Southeast Asia, not just for the U.S. And that's why you see Southeast Asia looking to BRICS. You see it looking into Global South. You see it seeking to navigate great powers. You see it, what I've always said is Southeast Asia has been masterful at internationalizing the search for autonomy, bringing in Japan, India, Korea, European Union. So Southeast Asia is not just complicated for the United States, it's complicated for Southeast Asia, in part because Southeast Asia is globalizing and engaging the world in a way that we haven't seen for decades. And all of these countries are beginning to do so in a very different and more complicated international environment.
Very interesting. Thanks for that. Steve, what does corporate Southeast Asia want to see from the new administration in DC, whoever it may be? And is Southeast Asia nimble enough to take advantage of the opportunities, say, supply chain openings?
Uh, I think if you're talking about a Harris administration, you can kind of sort of refer to Southeast Asia in having a certain shared interest. If you're talking about a Trump 2.0, then there is no Southeast Asia. It is all going to be bilateral. And what happens is going to be very different for different countries within Southeast Asia. So looking at a Harris administration, I think certainly safe to presume IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, continues under Harris administration. Hopefully, from a business community perspective, not only does it continue, but it expands. And the first pillar of IPEF, trade, which got derailed or paused, depending on how you want to look at it, last year, will continue and actually get implemented under a Harris administration. And when you have the U.S. engaging in that Indo-Pacific Economic Framework with countries across the region, including many in Southeast Asia, then you can talk about some types of Southeast Asia strategies under a Harris administration. I think a Harris administration would look to Southeast Asia as well as part of the U.S. competition with China. And yes, there are going to be some difficulties as you have that diversification out of China, especially not just U.S. companies diversifying out of China, but Chinese companies diversifying out of China. That is going to bring real challenges under a Harris administration. Now, if you look at a Trump 2.0, a country like Vietnam, which would likely get to be labeled a currency manipulator under a Trump 2.0, as it was going to be under a Trump 1.0 administration, that could really impact businesses in Vietnam, U.S. businesses, other businesses that source from Vietnam. So very different under Trump if you're in Vietnam. Malaysia also, which runs a significant trade deficit. Well, the U.S. runs a significant trade deficit with Malaysia. That is going to be treated much differently under a Trump administration than under a Harris administration. Singapore geopolitically is going to do fine under either. No question about that. However, Singapore is a trading nation. And if Donald Trump comes in and puts 10 to 20% tariffs on the world, on top of 60% tariffs on China, that is going to hit global trade. That is going to hit Singapore's economy. And so while Singapore bilaterally will be fine, regardless of who wins from an economic and trade perspective, it won't be fine. And I would just say the last thing where you were asking, what is it that businesses or corporates are looking for under either administration? And this is something I'm working on is with the American Association of the Indo-Pacific, and it's exactly what Prime Minister Singapore's new Prime Minister said in one of his first speeches, which is we're seeing this conflation of national security, economics, and trade, and it becomes very difficult for businesses and investors to do business or to invest if what's allowed today is not allowed tomorrow for national security concerns. There used to be a relatively clear line with what was and was not a national security issue. That line is blurring, and that is something that businesses and investors want to know. Please tell us where the line is. And right now, we don't quite know from a business investor community in a lot of areas, especially on tech, especially on AI. And that's what we'd look for under either new administration. And it is going to be a challenge under either administration, a Trump or a Harris one.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I just want to jump on that one point, Nirmal, if I could.
Go ahead.
In foreign policy and security studies generally, we use hedging to understand diplomatic and defense behavior. And it's explicable because the line is pretty thick. But when you securitize commerce in the way in which commerce is being securitized, then hedging can't be bifurcated from commerce. And so whether you think it's a small garden high wall on technology, or inward or outward FDI, or foreign direct investment, or particular elements of trade, or who trades with whom, and you make calculations, that securitization is much harder to hedge because the players inherently, greater or lesser depending on how closed your economy is and who controls the bulk of the economy. But in all economies, you have simply more players in commerce than you do in the defense realm or the diplomacy realm. So by definition, that coordination and that consensus is harder to arrive at when you securitize commerce.
Right, interesting. And since I have you both on, and I'm curious as to your opinion of Trump's plan to deport illegal uh, immigrants, migrants, right, by the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions. And of course, put additional tariffs from China, which we've talked about. But I have seen numerous studies which show that deporting up to 500,000, 1 million people is going to actually hurt the US economy. I was curious as to your views on that. Steve, perhaps you go first on that?
Sure, of course it will. I mean, yes. I have this debate. I often try to be more of an analyst and less of a partisan when I'm talking to friends out here, talking, giving speeches and presentations on the election, which I do quite often for banks and investment banks and private equity firms. And, a lot of people say, oh, well, I think Trump would be better for the economy than Harris. And I'm like, well, what do you think is going to happen if he deports 1 million plus people? What do you think is going to happen if you put 60% tariffs on China, 20% tariffs on the rest of the world? Do you think that's going to raise prices? And they say, well, yeah, of course it'll raise prices. I said, then why do you think Trump's going to be better for the economy than Harris? You can dislike some of Harris's positions on the economy, maybe on tax or what have you. But yes, I think that people who understand the economics would certainly look at the position the same way you do, Nirmal. It would be certainly inflationary. Put aside the human and element of what that would do to people who've been very productive as part of the U.S. economy and social and society.
Yeah, Satu, parting shot from you before we wrap up.
I am struck by how countries are thinking about navigating two persons who may become president in early November, or maybe soon after, who they know. These are known quantities. One has been president and took a particular set of propositions about US-Asia policy in 2016 to office. And here's where we are 8 years later. And another candidate who's been vice president, who's been in the region and closely associated with some of the key elements of continuity in US policy, hardening of strategic competition, maintenance of US allies and strategic partnerships, the build out of relationships in Southeast Asia, the improvement of relations with India, the expansion and enhancement of relations with the Pacific Islands region, which again, for the sake of this session, I want to talk about continuity because it's easy to focus on differences. And there are clear ones. I am not suggesting there aren't. What I am suggesting is the Trump administration met the freely associated states or the compact countries in the Pacific in the White House. That was continued by Secretary of State Pompeo going to those countries. It's continued with President Biden-Harris administration having 3 summits on the Pacific. The India element is a continuity between 2 administrations. So there's been tumult. And my net assessment is the threads of continuity are likely to overcome the threads of discontinuity insofar as narrow US-Asia relations are done. That's not only because of the way the executive branch works, but I would remind that we have a system where there are departments and agencies. I would remind that Congress has an extraordinary role in both authorization and appropriations. And so even if someone wishes to make dramatic changes, they will face constraints and speed bumps along the way. So whether it's on immigration or tariffs or commerce or alliances or bilateralism or multilateralism, um, these are continuities. The Quad is a continuity from the Trump administration, which revived the Quad in 2017. So, so I will end on that note, very hopeful note, and very, I think, a note that is to remind Asian listeners, viewers, that surely there will be changes, maybe ones we can't foresee, but there will also be continuities that are important to be mindful of.
Okay, excellent note. Stephen Oken, Satul May, thank you. Always a pleasure to have you both on Asian Insider. We certainly live in interesting times. Take care out there and safe travels to both of you. That nicely wraps this discussion up for the Asian Insider podcast. I'm your host, Nirmal Ghosh, and this episode was produced and edited by Faiza Sani. Join me and my expert guests for more episodes on the third and fourth Friday of every month.